Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at how to make this really nice chipped or peeling paint effect at the edges of your models using PBR Painter. I'm using Blender 3.3 and PBR Painter version 2.3.4. Okay, so let's make a start. So as I said at the start, the purpose of this video is to show how to get this nice chipped effect at the edges of the model. And to do that, I'm going to import some metal and paint textures, but you can do this with whatever you want. So you can have your own paint material. You can do it with paint on wood, for example, or you can just save this as a material in your asset browser and then reuse the masks whenever you need them. If you do want to save this material as an asset, please do watch my video on how to set that up properly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new material. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the material up. I do not need to back up the material. Clicking OK. I'll call this one Peeling Paint 2. And now I'm going to add my first layer, and this is going to be the metal. And for this one, I'm going to use the multi-texture import. And with that, I can just import the metal textures that I've used. You'll notice that you have this preference to check for existing textures, so this will make sure that when I import these, it won't create a second copy in addition to the ones that are already in Blender. So importing those, that's my setup. I need to change, for a start, I want to just change the texture mapping from UV to box. Other than that, I think I will leave that as it is. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second layer, and this is going to be my paint. And clicking OK. So I can do the exact same thing, and I can import the textures with this tool. As I said, you could also create your own paint material. You could use something you've already made previously, but I'm just going to use the textures that I already have. So again, just clicking this button, and then you just need to navigate to where you've saved your files. So when I do that, there's a few things you'll notice. First of all, it doesn't really look like the original material. So if I jump back to that one, obviously it's a totally different color, the roughness is different, various things are different about this paint compared to the one that I've just imported, even though it's the same set of textures. What I've actually done in that other material is I've gone through and I've changed some color settings. So I've gone in and I've adjusted the value and some other settings in here, and I've modified the color by playing around with settings in here. I've also modified the roughness by playing with the color ramp. Now I could go through and do that all again, but this is actually a useful time to demonstrate, for those of you who haven't seen this feature, the layer import feature. So instead of doing all that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this. And I'm going to go add new layer, and this time instead of creating a new layer from scratch, I'm going to go import layers. My material, I'm going to select peeling paint, and I'm going to import the peeling paint layer. Clicking OK. As you can see, what that's done is it's imported everything from that layer. Now it looks identical to the other material. So that is obviously a super useful tool, especially when you combine that with materials that you've got saved in the asset browser. Now, obviously that's also imported the layer masks. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those because I kind of want to do it from scratch just to demonstrate the process. So now we have a metal underneath and we have a paint on the top. Okay, so now that all of that's done, let's get to the main part of the video, which is the masks that are going to give that really nice edgeware effect. Okay, so I'm just going to close this down a little bit to clean things up. And I'm going to add my first mask. So the first thing I'm going to add is a preset, and this is going to be an edgeware mask. Okay, so the paint's almost completely gone, so let's take a look at that mask and see what's actually happening with that mask. So what it's done is it's nicely highlighted the edges. This edgeware mask comes with built-in noise, so that's why it looks kind of nice already as it is. But the problem is, obviously, we are not wanting to mask everywhere except the edges. We want the paint to be everywhere on here that is black. So we kind of want to invert the mask as the first thing that we do. So I'm going to do that under the color ramps. And I could invert either of these and it would have the same effect. So this is the color ramp associated with this mask. This is the color ramp that's associated with the whole stack of masks. So that's important when you have multiple masks. I prefer to invert the stack and then leave the individual masks as they are, but you can do it the opposite, just as long as you remember kind of what you've done. And so the reason we can't see it is I'm viewing the mask, I'm not viewing the stack at the moment. So the stack views the final output from the masks. And as we can see now, what it's doing is it's going to apply paint everywhere except for the edges. So that's the effect that we want to have. So let's go ahead and turn that preview off. Now we can see that it's nicely applying the paint everywhere except for these edges around here. The next thing I want to do is I want to make it a little bit less blurred on the edges because the paint's obviously not going to look like that. It's going to be sharper at those edges. So I'm going to pull this color ramp up and then pull these together, something like that. Fairly close so that it's nice and sharp on the edges. Now that looks quite nice as it is. So this is a built-in mask and it's designed for this purpose, so it will give you a fairly nice result straight out of the box. But I want to show something that's just a little bit more work, but will give a much nicer chipped paint effect. Before I do that, the next thing I want to do is I want to make it so that this current layer bumps out of the surface. So I want to make a little bit of a bump on the edges here, and I'm going to do that by turning on the layer bumping. So I already have a texture in the normals in here, but I'm going to turn on layer bump, and that will give me a little bit of a bump on these edges here. And I can adjust the strength depending on how I want that to look. I think I'll leave it like that for now, and we can play around with that later. Okay, so that's everything I want to do with that mask. Now what I'm going to do is add another mask to make it look like chip paint. So again, I'm going to add new mask, and this time I'm going to add another preset, and it's going to be a cracks mask. So clicking OK. Okay, so obviously it looks completely wrong at the start, but we're going to make some changes to make that look nice. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to preview the current mask, and I'm going to change some of these values in here. So I'm going to put the scale up to something like 50, because this is kind of going to form those little chips of paint. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the thickness by a lot. So I want it to look less like cracks and more like this kind of blended effect. And the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invert this color ramp. So I want it to be white in the middle and black around the edges like that. I'm going to go ahead and click preview the stack. And as you can see, it's kind of coming together. We have that kind of effect, but obviously it doesn't look right just yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this one from mix to multiply. And now what I can do is I can actually control this blend factor. So 0 being no effect. And I can multiply that in, and what it will do is it will just multiply with the other mask that's already there. And as you can see, if we have that at 1, now what it's doing is it's creating this nice kind of chipped effect around those edges. So let's turn that preview off. And as you can see now, it's looking really nice. So now what we've got is this kind of really subtle chipping effect at the edges of this material. Okay, so that's the main part of the setup. So everything's pretty much done now. At this point, it's basically just a matter of figuring out the extent of the wear that you want on your material. So there are a few different things we can do to change that. So first of all, if I go back to this first edge wear mask and just preview that mask, one thing I can do that works really well is I can change this curvature color ramp. And as we can see, that brings out that edge wear away from the edges. So if we do something like that, and then I go back to the stack, what you can see is it's kind of pulling out from the edges, and we can apply that edge wear further away from the edges. So let's see how that looks. Looks pretty good. I actually think the chipping is a little bit too excessive. So one thing I can do is just bring that multiplication factor down. So it's kind of mostly the edge wear, but just a little bit of chipping to something like that. And I might actually bring this back a little bit. The next thing you can do is you can also play around with the color ramps down here, especially this last color ramp. So if we bring this to the right, you're going to kind of get rid of it like that. And then the opposite's true. If we go to the left, you'll add more and more of that wear. So basically at this point, it's a balance between this color ramp, and essentially the multiplication factor here. I'm going to drop the normal strength a little bit because I think it's a bit too intense. And that's it. So that's the effect. I'll leave it to you guys to play around with your own models and fine tune for your own purposes. One more thing that I will show you before I go is I'll just demonstrate just quickly the kinds of things you can do once you've got this set up. So for example, if I want to say just add edge wear to the top of this model, so I don't really want kind of all this stuff down here, so maybe this is more exposed and this shouldn't be so damaged, I can do something like add a gradient mask And I'll preview that one. And I'm just going to rotate this just to kind of get the angle that I want. So if I do like that and then maybe move it along the X, something like that, what I can actually do is I can emphasize that top of the model like that. And if I change this to multiply, bring this down to 0 for a start, and then I'll preview the stack, what you'll see is if I slowly bring this up, it reduces all of the wear down here, so it's barely worn on the bottom, but it's got lots of wear on the top. So if I then get rid of that preview mode, looks pretty much as it did before on the top, but the back is kind of lost all of that wear. So I think that's a really nice effect, and that's a really common thing that you'll probably want to do. You can also do things like add masks based on normal direction. All of that will work really nicely in combination with these things. In addition to that, if you're using this material on your final model, so you're not just making the material to save in your asset browser, you can add a image texture mask and then paint over the regions that you want the chipping to appear. Bear in mind that as soon as you add an image texture mask like that and you paint, it makes the material specific to this model. So you can't say then save that material in your asset browser and reuse it, because it's all based on the UV mapping of your model. So just keep that in mind if you want to do that. Anyway, I think that's covered everything I wanted to cover, so I'm going to leave it there. Any questions, please leave them in the comments, or please do jump in the Discord server because there is a very active user base. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will catch you in another video. Cheers.